The smell of rotten grain, strangers' slender hands, a broken monocle around his neck, and an order to be transferred to the penal transport. He doesn't know where he is or who he is, but his brain has already done what it's been doing for 8 years. It counted the barrels in the corner, 12 instead of 19. 7 are missing. Someone here has set up a theft operation and has no idea that a man who counts everything has just moved into the tent. Daniel opens his eyes and recognizes nothing. A low ceiling made of dirty canvas, double-stitched, not army issue, not his army issue. His fingers tremble like a teenager's who has either been drinking for a week or hasn't eaten in that long. A cracked monocle dangles from his neck around his neck. On the floor, an overturned inkwell and an empty bottle of cheap wine. Next to it, a torn order with a seal, a foreign body, a foreign world. The tongue in his mouth remembers words he never learned, and his brain works as usual. Daniel sits up. He adjusts his monocle, and the first thing he does, not yet realizing where he is count the barrels. 12. He reaches for the table. He finds a crumpled inventory. It lists 19. The difference is 7. 7 barrels of oats have disappeared from the tent where he woke up a minute ago. Someone here is stealing. They've been at it for a long time, and quietly, because no one is counting. He stands up. His legs are weak. His knees buckle. His body weighs barely 50 pounds. In the mirror, a face of a 17-year-old, pale. His cheekbones are sunken from hunger. He turns away, grabs a piece of charcoal, draws up a ledger entry in 4 columns: receipts, expenditures, balance, discrepancy. His hands are shaking, but the lines are straight. He can do this with his eyes closed. He did this for 8 years in Kabul and Poznan and Ramstein. The only thing left from his former life, the ability to count. In 40 minutes, he knows more about this convoy than the man in charge. Oats are written off as spoiled every other week, always the same amount, always from the same wagon, always signed by the same corporal. It's not theft, it's an assembly line. Someone set up a system that runs like clockwork, and no one sees it because no one here knows what a system is. The sergeant enters, a big man with a tray. He spots the young guy in glasses amid the spread out papers and freezes. Daniel doesn't look up. He asks calmly, "Which one of you has been signing the oat ledger for the last 2 weeks?" The sergeant is silent. Daniel adds, "No weapons, just a talk." The sergeant sets down the tray and leaves. Daniel looks at his thin hands. He takes a bowl. He eats. The porridge is cold and oversalted. The bread needs to be soaked, but he eats. The first rule of field supply: eat when you can, sleep when you can, always keep count. For 3 days, he doesn't leave the tent. He reads every piece of paper: invoices, inventories, receipts, route sheets, blank columns, illegible signatures. The dates are mixed up. In one ledger, the wagon train arrives on the 3rd. In another, it departs on the 2nd. That is, it leaves before it arrives. And no one is bothered by this, because no one compares the figures. He writes everything down, every number, every name, every date. By the 4th day, he has a map. Not a geographical one, a financial one. He sees where the oats are going, where the horseshoes are disappearing, why the soldiers are walking in boots with holes in them, even though, according to the paperwork, new ones arrived a month ago. Everything converges on a single route, a single wagon, a single corporal, and one name at headquarters that's covering for that corporal. On the 5th day, Daniel gets up. He pulls on a stranger's uniform that hangs on him like a coat on a hanger. He wipes his monocle with his sleeve, and he goes to the quartermaster major. Major Kervin Holt is sitting at a desk over a stack of papers and looks like a man who hasn't slept in 2 days. His face is gray. His eyes are red. He looks up and sees a skinny young man with no insignia. Daniel places a sheet of paper in front of him, just one. On it is the arrival schedule for every wagon of the 7th Regiment over the past 40 days. Dates, times, weights, signatures. And at the bottom, a single line. The day after tomorrow, between the third and fourth bells, an empty wagon bearing Corporal Graves' seal will return to the convoy. Holt reads it. He asks who he is. Daniel replies that he is the junior quartermaster assigned 3 days ago. Holt asks how he knows about the wagon. Daniel replies that he doesn't know. He did the math. Every 11 days, one wagon returns empty. It leaves full, it comes back empty. The paperwork lists cargo damage, but damage doesn't happen on schedule. Illness happens. Theft happens. No spoilage. Under the false bottom, there will be 18 sacks of oats written off as spoiled. The major will send him and 2 trusted men there, and by evening, he'll have a case of embezzlement worth 4 gold pieces, the supplier's signature, the name of the one covering for him at headquarters. Daniel doesn't need anything for this, except for one thing. He wants to rewrite the inventory of the entire convoy, without an order, just like that. Holt stares at him for a long time. Then he laughs. A hoarse, bitter laugh from a man who's heard too many promises. He says the boy'd better go back to his barrels and not stick his nose where he isn't invited. Daniel nods. He takes the sheet. He leaves. He doesn't argue. He doesn't try to prove anything. He just waits. The day after tomorrow comes quickly. Between the third and fourth bells, a wagon turns onto the road, that very one, with Graves' seal. Empty. Daniel stands by the tent and watches it drive past. He doesn't move. He doesn't run. He stands. Half an hour later, a sergeant approaches him, that very one. He says the major wants to see him, right now. Daniel goes. There is no longer any laughter on Holt's face. He looks at the young man the way one looks at a weapon found in the mud, with caution, with interest, and with that cautious hunger that comes to people who have reached the end of their rope. He says 2 words, check the wagon. 3 hours later, Daniel is standing in front of the same table again. On it are 18 sacks of oats, a receipt signed by the corporal, and the name of the staff officer who received his share every 11th day. Holt looks at the sacks, then at Daniel, back at the sacks. He asks quietly, "What do you need?" Daniel replies, "The records, everything, from day 1. Holt nods. From that day on, Daniel Asher has the first person in the whole world who looks at him not as a bastard, but as a weapon. Daniel received the ledgers that evening, 4 trunks, stuffed so tightly with paper that the lids wouldn't close. He dragged them into his tent one by one. His body was weak, and after each chest he had to sit down and wait for his hands to stop shaking. Then he lit a candle, opened the first chest, and realized the scale of the disaster. These weren't records. This was trash. The documents lay in disarray, undated, unnumbered, receipts on scraps of cloth, invoices written on the backs of letters. One inventory was scrawled on a piece of leather that, judging by the smell, had been torn from a saddle. In the 3 years the penal convoy had existed, not a single person had ever attempted to compile these papers into a single table. And not because they were stupid, but because the very concept of a table did not exist in this world. Daniel closed his eyes. He took a deep ugh. The smell of wet canvas and rotten grain. He opened his eyes and began sorting. He worked 3 nights in a row. He slept in 2-hour bursts right on the floor next to the spread-out papers. He ate whatever the sergeant brought and didn't remember exactly what. On the second night, he realized he was running out of ink and began writing with charcoal stubs. On the third night, he ran out of charcoal and he burned wood chips from the crates to make more. By the morning of the 4th day, a chart hung on the wall of his tent, a large one, as tall as a man, written on sewn-together pieces of canvas. On the left, a column of dates. At the top, the names of the cargoes: oats, flour, salt, horseshoes, medicines, footcloths, candles, wine for the officers. Each cell was filled with 2 numbers. The first number was what was listed in the documents. The second was what was actually there. The difference between them was glaring. Oats. According to the documents, the convoy received 420 sacks over 3 months. In reality, 291 reached the soldiers. Salt. 80 barrels received, 43 arrived. Medicines. 40 gold pieces worth received, 11 arrived. The penal wagon train lost a third of its cargo every month, 3 years in a row. And this was a penal wagon train, the worst in the army, the smallest. If there were such losses here, what was going on in the main units? Daniel didn't want to think about that. Not yet. Right now, another question stood before him. How to stop the bleeding in a single convoy, and how to do it without authority, without rank, and without a single person to whom he could give an order. He started with the simple stuff, with the seals. In this world, cargo was transported in sacks and barrels that were unmarked. Anyone could open any sack at any stop, take out half, tie it back up, and no one would find out until the very end of the route, when it would be impossible to tell at which point the loss had occurred. Daniel asked Holt for 3 things: sealing wax, a seal he had carved himself from a piece of wood, and 10 minutes of each wagon master's time before departure. Holt gave them, without enthusiasm, more out of curiosity, like a man lets a child play with tools, expecting him to give up quickly. Daniel gathered the wagon masters, 7 men between 30 and 50, faces weathered by the wind, hands calloused. Their eyes were empty. They looked at the skinny boy and made no attempt to hide their contempt. He didn't make any speeches. He showed them 3 things. First, a wax seal with an imprint on every sack. Each seal is assigned a number. The number is recorded on the waybill at the time of loading. Upon arrival, the seals are checked. If a seal is broken, it's immediately obvious. Second, the waybill in duplicate. 1 copy goes to the senior driver. The second remains at the warehouse. Upon arrival, both copies are checked. If the numbers don't match, it means someone is lying, and that's immediately obvious. Third, colored tags. Red means urgent cargo. Yellow is standard. White is stock that can wait. Red cargo is unloaded first, always, no questions asked. The wagon masters listened in silence. One of them asked, "What if the seal is forged?" Daniel replied that he changes the seal every 3 days, and only he and Holt know the seal's design. Another asked why all this was necessary at all. They used to get by without seals and nothing happened. Daniel replied briefly, "Before, a third of the cargo never arrived." A silence hung in the air. One of the foremen snorted. Another spat. The third silently took the sealing wax and went to the wagons. The rest stood there for another minute and then dispersed. Not because they believed him, because Holt was standing behind Daniel and saying nothing. And when Holt is silent and doesn't interfere, that means an order in the penal convoy. The first results came in a week later. A convoy of 11 wagons left the warehouse and arrived at the frontline outpost. All 11 seals were intact. All 11 waybills matched. Losses? 0. For the first time in 3 years. 0. Holt read the report twice. Then he looked at Daniel. Then back at the report. He didn't say a word. But the next day, he gave Daniel the second desk in his tent. It was more than praise. It was a place. Daniel didn't celebrate. He knew that 0 losses on a single run was a fluke. The system works when 0 becomes the norm, and that takes time, and people need to get used to it. But people get used to the good slowly, and to the bad quickly. In a second week, the problems began. Corporal Graves, the very one whose name was on the fake waybills. He was arrested in connection with the wagon case. But Graves had friends, and those friends weren't happy that the skinny bastard had cut off their source of income. That night, someone slashed the canvas of Daniel's tent with a knife, a long cut from the ceiling to the floor, not to get in, to show that they could get in. Daniel noticed the cut in the morning. He looked at it. He thought. Then he took some thread and sewed the canvas up with a neat, even stitch, a double stitch. He didn't go complain to Holt. He didn't ask for security. He knew how these things worked. A complaint is a sign of weakness. Security is an admission of fear. And in a penal convoy, both mean they can keep pushing you around. Instead, he did something else. He put up a new chart. This time not in the tent, but right on the supply tent. In a prominent place. A big one. clear even to those who couldn't read because the numbers were drawn large, and next to each number was a picture. A sack, a barrel, a horseshoe, and 2 columns. Was, became. In the was column stood the old loss figures. In the became column stood the new ones. 0, 0, 0. One line below the chart. We're not losing any, so you're not going hungry. The soldiers read it. Some didn't believe it. Some didn't understand. But some understood very well. Those who received a full ration for the first time in months. Those who found meat in their rations instead of bones. Those who received new footcloths instead of torn ones. These people looked at the table and then looked at the skinny kid in glasses sitting by Holt's tent writing something. And something changed in their eyes. Not respect, not yet, but interest. 3 days after Daniel's tent was slashed, they came again at night. This time, no knife on the canvas. 3 people, shadows. He woke up to the sound. He didn't have time to get up. A blow to the stomach knocked him off the cot. A second blow to the ribs. A third to the back. They didn't speak. They beat him in silence, professionally, not to maim, to intimidate. Daniel curled up on the floor and covered his head with his hands. He didn't scream. He didn't call for help. He counted the blows. 7, 8, 9. On the 10th, they stopped. One of them leaned down and whispered, "Calm down." Daniel lay on the floor, breathing in fits and starts. His ribs were on fire, blood in his mouth. He lay there and thought, that's a good sign. They didn't understand, but it was a good sign. Because if they're beating you, it means you're getting in the way. And if you're getting in the way, it means the system is working. In the morning, he got up, washed his face. He adjusted his glasses. One arm of the frame was cracked and had to be wrapped with thread. His ribs ached with every breath. He sat down at the table and continued working. When Holt walked in and saw the bruise on his cheekbone, he asked what had happened. Daniel replied that he had fallen. Holt looked at him for a long time. Then he left. An hour later, Daniel heard a shout on the parade ground. Holt was mustering the convoy. Full formation. Every last one of them. Daniel didn't hear what he said, but after that muster, his tent was left alone, and they started addressing him by name. A month passed. The penal convoy had changed. Not beyond recognition, but enough for it to be noticed. 3 consecutive runs with 0 losses. The 4th with a 2% loss. The 5th, 0 again. 6 weeks ago, this convoy was considered the worst in the Northern Army, a place where they sent those they couldn't bring themselves to hang. Now it was strange. Not the best. Strange. A convoy that arrived on time. A supply train where the shipping documents matched. A supply train where the cargo was marked with colored tags and unloaded in the correct order. Red first. Always. The soldiers on the front lines who received supplies from the penal supply train stopped checking the sacks upon receipt. Not because they had become lazy, because the sacks were full. Every single time. And there was something so unusual about it that some officers on the front lines began asking questions. What had changed? Who was in charge of this? Daniel gave no interviews. He sat in Holt's tent and worked. Every day. From dawn until late at night. He rewrote all the supply forms. Replaced the old forms with new ones. A uniform format. A uniform size. Uniform columns. Sender's name. Recipient's name. Date of shipment. Date of receipt. Weight on loading. Weight upon unloading. Signature, stamp, seal number. Each form is numbered. The numbers run consecutively. If a form goes missing, it's immediately obvious. If a form is forged, it's evident during verification because its number doesn't match the ledger. The senior wagon drivers grumbled. Paperwork, more paperwork. Their hands were calloused from reins, not from pens. But they did it. Because Holt was standing behind them. And because the results were right before their eyes. Full rations, unscathed boots, oats for the horses that didn't disappear along the way. By the end of the 3rd week, Daniel began to look beyond the losses. Speed. He timed each trip, loading time, travel time, unloading time, time for the empty wagon to return. And he discovered a second flaw. The convoy was spending nearly twice as much time on the route as was necessary. Not because the roads were bad. The roads were bad, but that wasn't the main issue. The main issue was how the route was organized. The wagons left the warehouse and traveled to the front as a single convoy, 30 miles, sometimes 40, on a single road. No stops except for overnight stays. If one wagon broke down, the whole convoy stood still while it was being repaired. If the road was washed out, the whole convoy stopped until it dried out. If a horse was limping, the whole convoy stopped until its hoof was reshod. Daniel did the math. Over the last month, the convoy had stopped for a total of 4 days. 4 days out of 28. 14% of the time was lost to downtime. He proposed a different plan to Holt. Divide the route into 3 segments. Set up a staging point at the boundary of each section. A simple open area with a shelter, a water supply, and one person to keep track of things. The wagons travel the first section. At the first staging point, the cargo is transferred to fresh wagons with fresh horses. The first wagons return. The fresh ones proceed to the second checkpoint, and so on. No one stands idle. If a wagon breaks down on the first section, that's the first section's problem. The other 2 continue working. Holt listened. His face was impassive. His eyes were narrowed. He asked how much it would cost. Daniel answered, 2 wagons, 6 horses, 3 men, and 5 days to build. Holt asked what the benefit would be. Daniel answered, delivery speed would increase by 40%, because fresh horses go faster than tired ones, because the breakdown of one wagon doesn't halt the entire route, and because with this setup, the wagon train can make not 2 trips a week, but 3. Holt was silent for a minute. Then he nodded. 5 days later, 2 staging points appeared on the penal wagon train's route. 2 shelters made of poles and canvas. 2 clerks with forms. 6 horses taken from the reserve that Daniel had found in the records. The horses were listed as sick and were on rations even though they were healthy. They had simply been written off so as not to burden themselves with unnecessary worry. The first trip under the new plan took 4 days instead of the usual 7. Holt read the report. He read it again. He stood up from the table. He walked out of the tent. He stood in the rain for 5 minutes. He returned. He sat down. He looked at Daniel. He said one word. Onward. Daniel understood what that meant. Onward meant that Holt would no longer be checking his every move. Onward meant trust. Quiet trust. No speeches or handshakes. Just one word from a man who doesn't say a word more than necessary. And at that moment, a rider appeared on the road leading to the convoy. A woman. Tall. Red hair tied in a bun under a uniform cap. A weather-beaten face. Thumbs tucked into her belt. Behind her, 2 military police escorts. Captain Irene Vaughan of the Field Gendarmerie dismounted at Holt's tent and entered without introducing herself. She placed a warrant on the table, a royal one, with the seal of the War Office. She said she had come to investigate suspicious activity in the 3rd Corps' supply train. According to the War Office, the train had reported a 30% loss rate for 3 years. 2 months ago, the losses dropped to 0. That doesn't happen. Either someone has found a way to steal unnoticed, or someone is falsifying the reports. In either case, it's a crime. Holt turned pale. Not because he was afraid, because he understood how it looked from the outside. Daniel didn't turn pale. He stood up from the table. He walked over to the wall. He took down the chart hanging on the canvas. He placed it in front of Irene, and he said she could check every number, every single one. The seals, the waybills, the logbook, the waypoints. Everything is numbered. Everything is signed. Everything matches. If she found even one discrepancy, he would personally sign a confession. Irene looked at him. A boy, skinny, with glasses held on by a string, with a bruise on his ribs that was visible through the open collar of his uniform. She asked who he was. He answered. She asked where the system came from. He replied that he'd come up with it himself. She didn't believe him. She sat down at the table. She opened the first logbook and began to check. She checked for 3 days. Daniel didn't interfere. He just worked nearby. He answered questions when she asked. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He just showed her the papers, one after another. On the second day of the check, Irene asked for ink. She had run out. Daniel silently slid his inkwell over to her. She took it. Their hands were next to each other on the table for a second. His were thin, stained with soot. Hers were tanned, with calluses from gloves. She pulled her hand away. On the third day, she closed the last ledger. She stood up. She looked at Daniel, at Holt, back at Daniel, and said the accounts were in order. For the first time in her 7 years of service, she was seeing a wagon train where everything added up. She paused. Then she added, she was staying. Holt asked why. Irene replied that if it works in one convoy, she wants to see what happens when they try it in 2. She didn't say anything else. She didn't mention her father, or the quartermaster who was hanged 7 years ago for embezzlement he didn't commit, or the fact that in Halderon there was no system in which his innocence could be proven. And she didn't mention that she had just seen that system, lying on a table in the penal convoy's tent, written in charcoal on canvas, by a boy not yet 18. She didn't say any of that. She simply stayed. Irene Vaughan didn't just stay, she became a wall. In the very first week after her decision to stay, a request arrived at the convoy from the headquarters of the 3rd Corps. Colonel Grattan demanded an explanation as to why the penal convoy had stopped delivering oats via the old route through the village of Darehall. Daniel read the inquiry and saw between the lines what anyone who could do math would see. The village of Darehall stood 3 miles off the main route. A detour there added half a day to each trip. According to the documents, there was an intermediate warehouse in Darehall. In reality, there was a mill there owned by Colonel Grattan's cousin. Oats were delivered to this mill, written off as processed, and sold back to the army as flour at triple the price. A neat scheme. It had been working for years. And now Daniel, with his new route, had cut it off like a thread with scissors. He showed the request to Irene. She read it. Her expression didn't change. Only her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper. She asked if he had any proof. Daniel placed 3 sheets in front of her. The first, a list of oat deliveries through Darehall over the past 6 months. The second, a list of flour purchases from the mill in Darehall for the same period. The third, a table in which he had overlaid one set of figures on the other. The dates matched. The volumes matched. The prices didn't match in the right direction. Irene stared at the third sheet for a minute. Then she neatly folded all 3, put them in her folder, and said she would reply to the colonel herself. Daniel didn't know exactly what she had written, but the request was never repeated, and the convoy continued to travel along the new route. It was the first time Irene had shielded him from a blow from above. Not the last. By the end of the 2nd month, the penal convoy had ceased to be penal in substance, though formally it remained so on paper. 7 consecutive runs with losses no higher than 1%. Delivery time was cut by 43%. Soldiers on the front lines received full rations, hot meals 3 times a day if the situation allowed, unworn boots, enough footcloths, fresh medical supplies, not those expired 3 months ago. Regimental commanders began requesting supplies specifically through the penal convoy. It was unthinkable, as if hospitals had started sending patients to the morgue because it was cleaner there. Holt walked around looking like a man who had accidentally won the lottery and didn't know how to explain it to his neighbors. But Daniel was already thinking ahead. They gave him the convoy. 1 convoy, 40 wagons, 200 horses, 120 men, and he brought order to it. But 1 convoy is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. Halderon's northern army consisted of 4 corps. Each corps was supplied separately, without coordination, without a single plan, without a common inventory. The corps stole from one another, intercepted supply trains, held up shipments. One corps could have full warehouses while the neighboring ones starved 30 miles away. And no one knew this because no one was keeping track of the numbers. Daniel sat over the map at night, a large canvas map of the northern front that he had traced from Holt's map and supplemented with his own notes. The red dots were warehouses. The blue lines were routes. The black crosses were the places where supply trains lost their cargo most often. The yellow circles were things that didn't exist yet. what he called swallows, collapsible modular warehouses, lightweight structures made of standard wooden frames covered with canvas. Each swallow could be assembled in half a day by a team of 6 men. It could be dismantled in 3 hours. It could be transported on 2 carts. Inside, it could hold supplies for a company, 200 men, for 9 days. The idea was simple. Instead of huge, stationary warehouses that took months to build and became targets for imperial raids, instead, a network of small, mobile outposts that could be set up anywhere, packed up in 3 hours, and set up elsewhere. The enemy cannot destroy what does not stand still. But to launch the swallows, he needed more than a supply train. He needed a regiment. In the 3rd month, it happened. Not because anyone recognized his genius, because a catastrophe occurred. The 4th Regiment of the 3rd Corps was besieged. Imperial cavalry cut off the road to Fort Crane Hall, and the regiment found itself trapped without supplies. According to standard calculations by headquarters, the fort's supplies would last 8 days. On the 9th day, starvation would set in. On the 12th, the fort would have to surrender. Headquarters began preparing a relief operation. The mages needed 3 weeks to prepare. 3 weeks. The regiment couldn't wait 3 weeks. Daniel went to Holt with a plan. Holt read it. He turned pale. And he took Daniel to the chief of logistics for the 3rd Corps, General Merritt. Merritt was 62 years old. He had commanded rear units for 30 years. He had never heard the name Daniel Asher and had no intention of hearing it. Holt introduced Daniel. Merritt looked at the boy and asked Holt if this was a joke. Holt replied that it was not. Daniel laid the plan before the general. A route bypassing the Imperial cavalry. Through forest trails he had found on old maps. The road was 1.5 times longer, but passable for light wagons. At 3 points along the route, Daniel proposed setting up supply depots in advance with a stock of feed for the horses. The wagons would travel light until the first depot. They'll be loaded. They'll travel to the second. They'll switch to fresh horses. They'll travel to the third, and from there to the fort. The entire route takes 6 days. With a 2-day supply, they'd be safe from starvation. Merritt read the plan. His face was expressionless. He asked where to get the supply stations. Daniel replied that he would build them in 2 days using materials from the wagon train's warehouse. Merritt asked where to get horses for the intermediate stops. Daniel replied that the wagon train records listed 20 horses listed as sick. 14 of them are healthy. He checked personally. Merritt asked who would lead the wagon train. Daniel replied that he would. Merritt was silent for a long time. Then he looked at Holt. Holt nodded. Once. Briefly. Like a man who's putting all his eggs in one basket and knows it. Merritt signed the order. For the next 2 days, Daniel didn't sleep. He built sleds. 3 lightweight structures made of frames and canvas. He loaded them with fodder. He sent people ahead along the route. He checked every knot, every strap, every sack. Irene was by his side. She didn't ask questions. She assessed the men. Who could be trusted on a journey like this? Who would run if things got scary? Who wouldn't? She weeded out 4 and replaced them with her own gendarmes. The convoy set out at dawn on the 3rd day. 12 wagons, 32 people. Daniel on the first wagon. With a map on his lap, a charcoal pencil tucked behind his ear, glasses tied on with a string. It was raining. The forest trail had turned to mud. On the 2nd day, 1 wagon got stuck in the mud up to its axle. Daniel climbed down from the wagon. He walked over. He looked. He pulled a notebook from his breast pocket. He did the math. Then he said they needed to unload 4 sacks and transfer them to the next to it wagon. Remove the rear wheel, place 2 poles under the axle, lift it, put the wheel back on, reload. 20 minutes. The soldiers did it. The wagon was free. The convoy moved on. On the 4th day, they reached the first staging post. Everything was in order. The horses were fresh. The fodder was fine. The transfer took 2 hours. On the 6th day at dawn, the convoy approached Fort Crane Hall. The gates opened. The fort commander, Colonel Rhett, came out to meet them. He saw 12 wagons loaded with grain and flour and salt and medicine, and in front, on the first wagon, a boy in a wet uniform and crooked glasses. Colonel Rhett had fought for 20 years. He had survived 3 sieges. He had been wounded 4 times. He stood on the fort's wall and looked at the wagon train that had traveled an impossible route in 6 days, and his jaw twitched. He asked who was in command of the wagon train. They pointed to Daniel. Rhett walked over. He looked down at him. He asked his name. Daniel answered. Rhett nodded. Then he turned toward the fort and gave the order. The regiment formed up, 600 men, tired, hungry, in tattered uniforms. They stood and watched the supply train. Then Colonel Rhett did something unprecedented in the history of the Halderon army. He saluted the quartermaster. 600 men saluted with him. Daniel stood in front of the formation. Rain ran down his glasses. He didn't know what to do. He had never stood in front of the formation. He had always been behind the formation, behind the wagons, behind the charts. He adjusted his glasses, nodded, and went to unload the wagons. After Crane Hall, everything changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but irreversibly. General Merritt signed an order appointing Daniel Asher as the quartermaster for the 4th Regiment of the 3rd Corps, the very same regiment he had saved from starvation. Colonel Rhett had no objections. He even sent a note by courier containing a single sentence: "Don't get in this kid's way." Daniel read the note, folded it neatly, put it in a folder, and got to work. The 4th Regiment was 3 times the size of the penal transport. 2,000 soldiers, 400 horses, 60 wagons, its own smithy, its own infirmary, its own supply yard with 5 storage tents, and its own mess hall, which was 3 times the size of the supply yards. Daniel spent the first week just taking inventory. The result was the same as in the penal convoy, only worse. Losses weren't 30%, but 25%. Less in percentage terms, but 4 times as much in absolute numbers. In a month, the regiment lost enough oats to feed the penal convoy for half a year. Boots disappeared by the dozen, medicines vanished, salt. Salt was a whole other story. Salt in this world was worth its weight in silver. Soldiers were entitled to a quarter-pound a week. According to the records, they received it. In reality, half of them received flour mixed with sand and were convinced that was how it was supposed to be. Daniel couldn't restore order on his own. In the penal convoy, he had worked alone with Holt's silent support. Here, he needed people who could count. And that's where he ran into a problem that was bigger than any theft. In the regiment, there were 218 men in the support unit. Of those, 131 could read. Of those who could read, 43 could do columnar addition. Of those who could do columnar addition, 9 could add 3-digit numbers without making a mistake. 9 people for 2,000 soldiers. Daniel sat staring at that number and thought, 9. You can't build a system with 9 people. With 9 people, you can plug the holes, but the holes will appear faster than you can plug them. He needed someone, just one person. Someone who could not only count, but count quickly and accurately. Someone who could serve as a second brain. Someone who could keep track of things while he handled the planning. He found that person on the 3rd day, in the very last place he expected. Among the clerks of the 4th Regiment was a skinny young man named Yoon So. Quiet, unobtrusive. He sat in the corner of the supply tent, copying documents in neat, small handwriting. Daniel didn't notice him because of his handwriting. It was because of a single ledger lying on the young clerk's desk. A ledger of horseshoe expenditures for 3 weeks, neatly written. The columns were even. And in the lower right corner was a note that wasn't on any other report in the entire regiment. Total, with a sum. The correct sum. Daniel stood over the sheet and stared at the note. No one in this army had been tallying the totals. No one had been adding up the numbers at the bottom of the page, because no one needed it. But this clerk had done it himself, without orders, simply because it was the right thing to do. Daniel sat down next to the clerk. He asked his name. Yoon So. He asked where he was from. Yoon replied that he was from the So trading house. Southern Province. Daniel asked why he was adding up the totals. Yoon looked at him warily. He replied that without totals, they make no sense. A column of numbers without a total is just a column of numbers. Daniel nodded. Then he placed a sheet of paper in front of Yoon and asked him to add 3 numbers. 437, 291, 563. Yoon didn't pick up a pen. He looked at the numbers for 2 seconds and said, 1,291. Correct. No pencil, no column, 2 seconds. Daniel asked the second question. If the regiment consumes 23 sacks of oats a day, and the stock in the warehouse is 392 sacks, how many days will the stock last? Yoon answered after a second, 17 days. And without pausing, he added that this didn't account for transit losses. With a 5% loss rate, the actual supply is 372 sacks. That means 16 days, and there will be 5 sacks left over. Daniel looked at this quiet young man and saw something no one else in the army saw. He saw his right-hand man. From that day on, Yoon So became his personal assistant. Officially, it was the position of senior accountant. Unofficially, Yoon became the only person in the regiment who knew as much as Daniel. Every number, every route, every name. They worked together 16 hours a day. Daniel planned. Yoon calculated. Daniel mapped out routes. Yoon checked the calculations. Daniel spoke with the officers. Yoon kept the records. After a week of working together, Daniel realized one more thing. Yoon didn't just calculate quickly. Yoon memorized everything. Every number that passed through his hands remained in his memory. Daniel could ask at any moment how many horseshoes the 2nd platoon had received 3 weeks ago, and Yoon would answer without looking at his papers. It wasn't just useful, it was a weapon. At the end of his 2nd week working in the regiment, Daniel discovered something he hadn't expected. Yoon So wasn't Yoon. Yoon So was a woman. He didn't notice it from the voice or the figure. Yoon disguised herself skillfully. Short hair, a loose shirt, a low voice honed over the years. He noticed it from the handwriting. In the trading houses of the Southern Province, girls were taught a special style of writing, small curls at the ends of the letters. It was the girls' handwriting of the trading house. Boys were taught differently. Daniel was silent for 3 days. Then one evening, when they were alone together poring over the ledgers, he said, "Yuna." She froze. The pen in her hand stopped. She didn't look up. She waited. Waited for what happened every time she was exposed. Exposure, shame, banishment. Daniel continued. He said he needed a senior accountant who could calculate in her head faster than any officer in this army. He didn't need a man. He didn't need a woman. He needed a brain. Her brain. And if she stayed, he would rewrite her contract. Under her real name, with a real salary. Yuna looked up. Her eyes were filled with tears. She asked if he would fire her. Daniel replied that firing the only person who could calculate better than him would be the stupidest decision of his life, and he had already made plenty of stupid decisions. Yuna laughed, quietly, through her tears, and went back to the ledger. They worked until dawn. By the end of the first month in the regiment, the system was in place. Seals, waybills, waypoints, swallows. Everything Daniel had perfected on the penal convoy was now working on a regimental scale. Losses dropped from 25% to 7%, then to 4%, then to 2%. The soldiers of the 4th Regiment ate 3 times a day. Hot meals, with meat, with salt, with bread that didn't need to be soaked. In the 3rd week, something happened that Daniel hadn't planned on. An old sergeant from the 2nd platoon came to see him in the evening. A big man, gray-haired, a scar across his cheek, hands like shovels. He stood in front of Daniel's table and stood silently for a minute. Then he asked, "Is it true that every soldier now gets a full ration?" Daniel answered yes. The sergeant asked every day. Daniel answered every day. The sergeant was silent. Then he said quietly, "His boy died last winter, 16 years old, a private. Not by the sword, not by magic, by scurvy, because there had been no fresh food for 6 months. 6 months. He stood before Daniel, an old soldier who had outlived his son. And Daniel saw in his eyes not gratitude, not respect, rage. The quiet, white rage of a man who realized his son had died not because there was no food, but because no one had counted. Daniel stood up, looked the sergeant in the eye, and said, "Now they count." The sergeant nodded. He turned around. He left. The next morning, Daniel found a wooden figurine carved from a piece of wood at the entrance to his tent. A little soldier with a pack on his back, a gift from a man whose hands were more accustomed to a sword than a knife. Daniel placed the figurine on the table next to the inkwell. It stood there until the end of the war. Irene noticed the figurine that same day. She didn't ask where it came from. She just looked at Daniel a little longer than usual. Then she went back to work. But from that day on, a new section appeared in her folder, a list of officers she considered a threat to Daniel. Not criminals, not thieves, those who could harm him simply because he was changing the order they had lived by for 20 years. She kept this list in silence. She didn't show it to him. She didn't discuss it. She just kept it. Because Irene Vaughan knew better than anyone on this front what it meant to lose a man she hadn't been able to protect. Rumors spread faster than supply trains. By the 4th month on the front, Daniel Asher's name was known in 2 out of 4 corps. Not because he sought glory, because the results were impossible to hide. The 4th Regiment had become an anomaly. The only unit in the Northern Army where soldiers didn't sell their boots to camp followers for a swig of wine. The only unit where horses didn't collapse from exhaustion on the march. The only unit where the infirmary received its medical supplies on time, rather than a month after the wounded had managed to die or recover on their own. Commanders of neighboring regiments sent people to take a look. They came and couldn't believe their eyes. They left and told others. And the more they told, the louder the buzz became. The buzz reached the capital. Daniel learned of it one morning at the beginning of the 5th month when Irene entered the tent with a face whose every crease he had learned to read over the past 4 months. Now those lines spoke of trouble. She placed a letter before him, sealed with the seal of the Halderon Magic Council. Cassian Morel, an archmage of the Red Rank, was notifying the command of the 3rd Corps of his visit to inspect a new method of logistical support. Arrival in 7 days. Daniel read the letter twice. A Red Rank archmage, the 2nd highest rank in the mage hierarchy. A man who could turn a wagon yard into a lake of molten glass with a single spell. And he was coming here, to look at the charts. Irene said that was bad. Morel isn't coming to inspect. Morel is coming to destroy. For 7 years, the Magic Council had been convincing the king that the war was won by magic, that more mages were needed, more reagents, more money for the council. And now, here comes a boy without a shred of magic, who does what 3 archmages of the council couldn't do in 7 years. He makes the army combat ready, without a single spell. This isn't just an insult, it's a threat. If the king sees that victory is possible without mages, the council's budget will be cut in half. And the council's budget is power. Daniel listened and nodded. He understood. He'd seen this on Earth. Different uniforms, different words, same mechanics. Whoever controls the resources doesn't want anyone to prove that resources can be spent differently. He asked Irene what she suggested. Irene replied that she suggested hiding half the documents, to show Morel a pretty picture, not to give him the full picture, so that he would leave with the impression that this was a minor improvement, not a revolution. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. No, he would show everything. Irene looked at him the way people look at someone walking into a burning house. She asked why. Daniel answered, because Morel is smart. If he sees half of it, he'll realize the other half is hidden and decide they're hiding something dangerous. If he sees everything, he'll see the numbers. And numbers don't offend. Numbers just are. Irene disagreed, but she didn't argue. She knew Daniel was stubborn when it came to his spreadsheets. For 7 days, Daniel prepared. Not for a defense, for a presentation. He compiled a full report on the 4th Regiment, every metric, losses before and after, delivery speed before and after, expenditures by category, cost of innovations, savings, all on one large sheet, clear, neat, with numbers that spoke for themselves. Una helped. She copied it out neatly. Her handwriting was perfect, straight lines, crisp numbers, not a single smudge. Daniel watched her work and thought she had the handwriting of a surgeon, precise and ruthless. Cassian Morel arrived on the 7th day, right on time. Daniel noted that. A man who arrives on time respects time. That's something. Morel didn't look the way Daniel had expected. No billowing cloak, no flaming staff. A man in his 50s, of average height, a graying beard, trimmed short, a dark red uniform with a scarlet stripe on the sleeve, the only sign of rank. Gray eyes, attentive. He entered the tent accompanied by 2 assistants and looked at the walls, at the charts, at the ledgers, at the route map, at the swallows drawn on the diagram, at the seals laid out on the table as samples. He looked in silence for 3 minutes. Then he turned to Daniel. He asked who had done this. Daniel replied that he had. Morel asked where he had studied. Daniel replied that he hadn't. It was true in the sense that Morel could understand it. Morel walked over to the main chart, casualties by month. He ran his finger down the column of numbers. He stopped at the last row. 2%. He asked quietly. 2% losses at the regimental level. Daniel replied that it was, and that he considered it too high a number. The goal is 1%. Morel turned to him, and for the first time, Daniel saw in the Archmage's eyes not contempt, not anger, confusion. Morel didn't understand. He was used to a world where magic solved everything, where warehouses were protected by barriers, not seals, in which cargo is teleported rather than hauled on carts. And here stood before him a boy who had achieved what magic could not. Not because magic is weak, because magic doesn't count. A mage can cast a barrier over a warehouse, but a mage cannot count how many sacks should be behind that barrier and how many disappeared before the barrier was cast. Morel spent 3 days at the 4th Regiment's supply yard. He checked everything, just like Irene had 4 months ago. But Irene had checked for honesty. Morel checked for logic. He asked questions, lots of questions. Why were the staging points at these distances and not others? Why were there 3 colored tags and not 5? Why were the swallows exactly this size? Daniel answered every one, with numbers, with calculations, with examples. Morel listened. On the 2nd day, he stopped asking questions and started taking notes. A small, leather-bound notebook, quick, neat handwriting. Daniel saw what he was writing and didn't interfere. On the 3rd day, Morel was getting ready to leave. He stood by the tent and looked out at the wagon yard. The wagons were being loaded according to the new system. Seals, tags, waybills in duplicate. A clerk with a form at every station. Everything was working. Quietly, smoothly. No shouting, no chaos. Morel turned to Daniel. He said he didn't understand how it was possible. Daniel replied that it wasn't magic. It was arithmetic. Morel was silent for a moment. Then he said he would be back in a month, and that he wanted Daniel to explain everything to him from the very beginning, slowly, as if to a child. Daniel nodded. Morel left, with his notebook. Irene stood nearby and watched him leave. She said that Daniel had either just found an ally or just given the enemy a complete map of his positions. Daniel replied that it was one and the same. If Morel was an ally, the map would help him. If he was an enemy, he would find what he was looking for even without the map. Better to tell the truth than to let him make up his own version. Irene didn't reply, but in her folder, next to Morel's name, a mark appeared. Not crossed out, not underlined, just a question mark. 2 weeks after Morel's departure, another guest arrived at the 4th Regiment's camp, this time without warning, without a letter, without a seal. She simply appeared in the wagon yard on a white horse, accompanied by 2 grooms. An azure-colored dress, long, light hair, a face of such perfect beauty that the wagon soldiers dropped their work and stood with their mouths agape. Archmage of the Azure rank, Lyriel Sane. She dismounted. She looked around. She saw the mud. She saw the wagons. She saw the sacks. Her face expressed that particular look of disgust that people accustomed to marble have when they see canvas. She asked the nearest soldier where to find Quartermaster Asher. The soldier pointed to a tent. Lyra entered. Daniel was sitting at a table, poring over a ledger. Una was nearby, copying a form. Irene stood by the wall, sharpening a pencil with a knife. Lyra stopped in the center of the tent and looked at all 3 of them. Then she said that she had been sent by the Magical Council to assist with new methods of logistical support for the 4th Regiment. Her voice was even. Her words were precise, each in its place, like coins laid out in a row. Irene stopped sharpening her pencil. She knew what assistance from the Magic Council meant. It meant supervision. It meant a spy. Daniel raised his head. He looked at Lyra. Beautiful, very beautiful. A dress impossible for field conditions. Her hands were white, not a single callus. He nodded, and said the first thing that came to mind. Lady Sane. He had a business matter for her. How many liters of water per day could she consistently purify without tiring? He needed it to calculate the water supply for 3 regiments on the march. Lyra looked at him for 10 seconds. Una stopped writing. Irene froze with a knife in her hand. No one had ever asked Lyriel Sane a question about capacity. They asked her what her rank was, what her lineage was, what her potential was. But how many liters? That was a question you'd ask a well, or a pump, or a tool. Lyra opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and said, 400 liters, per day, without loss of concentration. If you allow me to use the blue vine reagent, then 600. Daniel wrote it down, nodded, and returned to the ledger. Lyra stood in the middle of the tent, in a sky-blue dress, amid sacks and papers, and didn't know what to do next, because for the first time in her life, she had answered a question about herself with a number. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. Lyra stayed. For the first few days, she wandered around the camp yard like a cat in a doghouse. Her dress caught on the stakes, her shoes got stuck in the mud. Soldiers turned to look. She pretended not to notice, but she did. Daniel paid her no mind, not because he was ignoring her, because he didn't have time for that. It was the 5th month. The 4th Regiment was running like clockwork, but the other 3 regiments in the Corps continued to lose a third of their supplies, and every week the gap between the 4th Regiment and the rest became more obvious. The commanders of the neighboring regiments began to get angry, not because they were jealous, because their own soldiers had started asking questions. Why does the 4th Regiment get 3 meals a day and we only get 2? Why does the 4th Regiment have intact boots while ours are in bandages? It was dangerous. A hungry soldier who doesn't know there's another way stays silent. A hungry soldier who sees his neighbor is full rebels. Daniel understood this. He came to Irene at night. She was sitting in her tent over a folder, that very folder, the list of officers. He sat down across from her and said he needed the entire Corps. Irene looked up. He explained. A system that works in one regiment but doesn't work in the 3 neighboring ones is worse than no system at all. It creates envy. Envy creates conflict. Conflict destroys combat effectiveness. He needed to extend the system to the entire Corps or abandon it altogether. Irene asked how he planned to do that. He had no authority. General Merritt had given him 1 regiment, not 4. Daniel replied that he wasn't going to ask for authority. He was going to make sure the authority came to him on its own. 3 days later, he presented a report to Merritt, not on the 4th Regiment, on the entire Corps. A summary table of casualties across all 4 regiments over the past 6 months. Next to each row was a mark. Red if casualties were above 20%, yellow from 10 to 20, green below 10. The 4th Regiment glowed green. The other 3 blazed red. Merritt looked at the table and his face changed. He saw something he had never seen before, not because he didn't know about the problems, because no one had shown him the problems like this, in a single table, at a single glance, without 20 pages of reports that he never finished reading anyway. Daniel didn't ask for anything. He just put down the chart and left. 2 days later, Merritt called him back and gave him a corps, the entire 3rd Corps, 8,000 men, logistics, full responsibility. Daniel nodded. He walked out of Merritt's tent, made his way to his own, sat down, and realized his hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the scale of it. He could keep a single regiment in his head, every number, every name, every wagon. The corps wouldn't fit in his head. He needed people, not just one assistant, a team. He started with Una, told her he needed 10 people who could count. Una replied that there were no such people in the corps. Daniel said that meant they needed to be taught, in 2 weeks. Una looked at him, then nodded, and she began. She selected 15 people from the wagon crews of all 4 regiments, not the smartest, the most careful, those who could write a number neatly and didn't confuse a 6 with a 9. Daniel drew up a lesson plan, 3 hours a day, in the morning, before work began. Addition, subtraction, filling out forms, reading waybills, checking seals. Una taught. She turned out to be a strict teacher, patient but merciless toward mistakes. If a student mixed up the numbers, she made him rewrite the page from the beginning. Not as punishment, because a mistake in a number isn't just a blunder. A mistake in a number is a hungry soldier, or a dead soldier. After a week, 11 remained out of 15. 4 couldn't handle it. After 2 weeks, the 11 could fill out the form without mistakes. Not quickly, but without mistakes. Daniel assigned them to the regiments, 2 per regiment, plus Una in the center, plus himself. And the network was up and running. Every evening, 2 record keepers in each regiment collected the day's data. They sent it to Una by courier. Una compiled it. In the morning, the overall picture of the complex for the past 24 hours lay on Daniel's desk. How much came in, how much went out, how much was lost, where the problem was. He saw the corps as a living organism. Blood flowed through the arteries of the roots. The heart beat in the warehouses. The lungs breathed at the transfer points. And when there was a clot somewhere, he saw it in the numbers before the commander of that regiment noticed it with his own eyes. In the midst of this work, Lyra came to him with a question. She stood at the entrance to the tent, no longer in her azure dress, but in a dark blue travel suit with rolled-up sleeves, mud on her boots, her hair pulled back into a simple knot. She said she had been observing the 2nd Regiment's water supply system. The well on the route between the 2nd and 3rd staging areas yields dirty water. The soldiers are drinking it. They're getting sick. The infirmary is overflowing. She can clean that well. 400 liters a day, enough for a company. But she'll have to stand there for half a day. And she needs a tent. And blue vine reagent, 3 vials. Daniel looked at her. She wasn't flirting. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't playing games. She came with a specific problem and a specific solution. With numbers. He pulled out the route map. He found the spot. He did the math. If Lyra purified the water at this staging area, the number of 6 soldiers in the 2nd Regiment's infirmary would drop by 1/3 within 10 days. That would free up 20 beds. 20 beds meant 20 soldiers returning to duty. He said yes. The tent would be there tomorrow. The reagent in 3 days. He'll order it through Holt. Lyra nodded, turned to leave, stopped, said without turning around, she wasn't a spy. I mean, she had been sent to spy, but she wouldn't, because what he was doing worked, and she wanted to be part of what worked, not part of those who got in the way. Daniel was silent for a second. Then he replied that he knew. He'd known from day one. A spy who wants to cause harm doesn't offer to clean out the well. Lyra turned around. Her cheeks were pink, not from embarrassment, from anger at herself, because she thought she'd hidden it well, and he'd known from day one. She left. Una sat in the corner and watched her go. Then she looked at Daniel. He was already counting again. Una went back to the forms, but the pen in her hand moved a little faster than usual, and the letters were a little sharper. In the 6th month, everything was going well. Too well. Core losses had dropped to 8%. Delivery speed had increased by 35. 4 regiments were operating under a single system. The forms were identical. The seals were identical. The tags were identical. Any clerk from any unit could sit down at a desk in any other unit and continue working without training. This was what Daniel called standardization. In this world, there was no word for this concept. And it was precisely at this moment, when everything was running smoothly, and Daniel, for the first time in 6 months, allowed himself to go to bed before midnight, that a scream woke him. The scream came from behind the supply tent, short, abrupt, as if the screamer's mouth had been clamped shut. Daniel jumped up. His body reacted before his mind did. Feet into boots, hand to the knife on the table. A small knife for cutting parchment. Not a weapon, a habit. He ran out of the tent. Darkness. The moon behind the clouds. The light of torches at the guard post 100 paces away. Between the tent and the warehouse, a shadow. A large one. Moving quickly. A second shadow. A third. Daniel froze. His body was 17 years old and weak. His brain was 34 years old, and understood very well that 3 armed shadows in the darkness were not a dispute over a card debt. They were after him. He retreated into the tent, grabbed the folder from the main table, that very one, with the double-entry bookkeeping, with the actual calculations, with the coded notebook containing what could get him hanged. He pressed it to his chest, and crawled out through the back wall of the tent. The canvas was damp. He squeezed through with difficulty. He rolled over, got up, ran. Not toward the guard post, toward Irene's tent. The shadows noticed him, footsteps behind him. Daniel ran, knowing he couldn't escape. His body wasn't up to it. His lungs were burning after 20 steps. His legs were tangling. He was a boy. They were grown men. They would catch up in 10 seconds, in 5, in 3. A blow to the back. He fell face first into the mud. The folder flew out of his hands. Someone piled on top of him, heavy. A hand in a leather glove clamped over his mouth. The smell of sweat, glands, blade oil. These aren't soldiers. Soldiers don't carry blade oil. These are professionals. A voice by his ear, quiet, calm, in the imperial dialect with a slight accent. Nothing personal. Then a knife. Daniel felt the cold of the blade against his neck. No pain, not yet, just cold. And at that moment, something happened. A sound. Short. Wet. Like the strike of a butcher's knife on a cutting board. The weight on his back twitched, gasped, fell to one side. Daniel rolled over. A figure stood in the darkness, small, narrow-shouldered, black hair, 2 short blades, one in her hand, the second in the throat of the man lying next to Daniel. Cyan Pack. She didn't say a word. She stepped forward. The second attacker stepped out of the darkness with a sword. Cyan dodged the blow as easily as water flows off a stone, effortlessly, without a single extra movement. She simply flowed from one spot to another. Her blade swept upward. The man fell. The third one ran. Cyan didn't chase after him. She turned to Daniel. She approached him. She bent down. She checked his neck. A cut, shallow. Blood, but not life-threatening. She pulled a strip of cloth from behind her belt, bandaged it, quickly, silently. Her hands were warm, her fingers calloused. Daniel lay in the mud and looked up at her. The first question he asked, "Who hired her?" Cyan answered, "Major Holt, a 6-month contract, paid in advance, out of his own pocket." Daniel closed his eyes for a second. Holt, old cunning Holt. He knew that sooner or later they would come for Daniel. He couldn't assign official security to him because the penal convoy had no budget for security. But he could hire a bodyguard from the Order of the Silent Blade. A private one. Unofficial. Invisible. And he did it, without saying a word to Daniel, because if he had, Daniel would have refused. He would have said the money was needed for fodder. Daniel stood up, picked up the folder, checked it. The pages were there, dirty but intact. He looked at the bodies. 2. Dark clothing, light weapons. No insignia, no documents. Professionals. Irene appeared a minute later, barefoot, with a sword in her hand. Behind her, 2 gendarmes with torches. She saw the bodies. She saw the blood on Daniel's neck. She saw Zion. Her face turned to stone. She didn't ask what had happened. She had seen everything. She turned to the gendarmes and began giving orders. Examine the bodies, search the area, question the guards, interrogate the third one, the one who fled. Find him. By morning, the picture was clear. The two dead men were not Haldoran's soldiers. Judging by their weapons and equipment, they were Imperial intelligence, professional hitmen sent across the front lines. One had a note sewn into the lining of his tunic. The target. A logistics officer of the 3rd Corps. No name given. Description: young. Glasses. A tent next to the supply tent. Irene held the note, and her hands didn't shake, but the knuckles of her fingers had turned white. She looked up at Daniel. He was sitting at the table, with a bandage around his neck, with a dirty folder in front of him, and he was counting yesterday's casualties for the 3rd Regiment. Irene asked how he could count now. Daniel answered without looking up, because if he stopped counting, he'd start thinking about what had happened, and if he started thinking, his hands would start shaking, and if his hands started shaking, he wouldn't be able to write, and if he couldn't write, then tomorrow someone wouldn't get their rations, and he couldn't let that happen. Irene was silent. Then she sat down next to him and silently began sorting through the papers he hadn't had time to go through yesterday. They worked until dawn. Zion sat at the entrance to the tent, on the floor, with her legs crossed, blades on her knees. She hadn't slept. She hadn't slept all night, and she wasn't going to sleep. In the morning, Daniel stepped out of the tent. He saw Zion. She was sitting in the same position, eyes open, back straight. He looked at her. Small, thin, expressionless face, short-cropped black hair, 2 blades, and absolute silence around her, as if the air froze when she was nearby. He asked if she had eaten. She didn't answer. He went back into the tent. A minute later, he came out with a bowl, hot soup, a morning ration from Maggie's field kitchen. He set it in front of her, said it was an order from the employer. Eat while seated, sleep 6 hours, a hot lunch every day. He had rewritten the contract. It was in there now. Zion looked at the bowl, then at him, then back at the bowl. Steam rose from the soup. Pieces of meat floated in the soup. Real meat, not raw, not gristle, meat. She took the bowl, raised it to her face, inhaled, then began to eat, sitting down, for the first time in as long as she could remember. On the second spoonful, tears streamed from her eyes. She didn't make a sound, just tears, down her cheeks, into the soup. She ate and cried, and didn't understand what was happening to her. Because in the Order of the Silent Blade, they don't teach you to understand tears. They teach you to stop them. Daniel stood nearby and didn't leave. Not because he wanted to watch, because he couldn't leave a person who was crying, even if that person could kill 3 people in the dark in 4 seconds. When Zion finished eating, she set the bowl down. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked up and said one word. "Thank you." It was the first word she'd ever said to him that wasn't business. From that day on, Zion Pak became Daniel Asher's shadow. Not by contract. The contract was for 6 months. She stayed for the entire war and everything that came after. Imperial assassins attacked Daniel at night and nearly killed him. He was saved by Zion Pak, a mercenary from the Order of the Silent Blade, secretly hired by Holt. Daniel rewrote her contract to include hot meals and 6 hours of sleep, and for the first time in her life, Zion ate while sitting down and cried because of it. She remained his bodyguard not by contract, but by choice. The assassination attempt changed everything. Not in the sense that Daniel was scared. He was scared, but that wasn't why. The attempt changed how people looked at him. Before that night, he was a strange boy with his charts. After that night, he became a target. And only those who are dangerous become targets. Everyone understood that. The news spread throughout the building within a day. Imperial intelligence had sent assassins for the quartermaster. Not for the general, not the mage, the quartermaster. It was so unusual that even those who considered Daniel an upstart fell silent. Because if the enemy was spending resources to kill a man, it meant that man was worth more than they had thought. Merritt sent official guards, 4 soldiers. Zion looked at them with the same expression a wolf gives to sheepdogs, but she didn't object. 4 pairs of eyes are better than 1, even if those eyes see half as well. Daniel kept working. His neck was healing. The scar remained, a thin white line just below her chin. Una saw the scar on the first morning after the assassination attempt, and her hand clenched the pen so hard it snapped. She didn't say anything. She just broke the pen. Then she took a new one and continued. But from that day on, she stopped leaving the tent after work. She worked until she fell asleep right at the table, and she woke up before Daniel, as if she were always nearby, nothing bad would ever happen again. The 6th month was drawing to a close. The facility was running smoothly. Losses had dropped to 6%. Swallows were stationed on every route. The forms were standardized. The accountants were trained. The system didn't depend on a single person. If Daniel disappeared tomorrow, the system would run on its own for another 3 months before it began to break down. That was important. That was exactly what he had been striving for. Not to be irreplaceable, to be unnecessary. Because the best system is one that works without its creator. But the world didn't give him time to savor it. In the 7th month, the order to advance arrived. The Northern Army was launching a counteroffensive. For the first time in 2 years. 4 corps were to move north along the Crane River. The objective? To recapture the 3 provinces lost last year. Headquarters had drawn up a plan, a beautiful plan. 2 flanking attacks, a central breakthrough. 3 archmages of the council on the front line, cavalry on the right flank, infantry in the center, and not a word about supplies. Daniel read the plan at the meeting at Merritt's and felt a chill run down the back of his neck. He did the math in his head. An advance 40 miles deep into Imperial territory, 4 corps, 32,000 men, 8,000 horses, daily grain consumption during active march, 200 tons, forage consumption, 120 tons, water consumption during a summer march, 60,000 liters per day for the men alone, not counting the horses. Supply routes grow longer every day as the army advances. By the 10th day of the advance, the supply line will stretch 70 miles. At the current speed of the supply trains, that's 4 days one way, 8 days per trip, with a requirement of 2 trips per week for each half regiment. There won't be enough wagons. There won't be enough horses. There won't be enough roads. The army will come to a standstill from starvation on the 12th day of the offensive, and that's in the best-case scenario. He asked to speak. Merritt granted him the floor. Daniel stood up and said that the offensive, in its current form, would fail in 12 days, not because of the enemy, because supplies. The tent fell silent. Merritt was looking at him. The Corps Chief of Staff, Colonel Weiss, was looking at him. 2 regimental commanders were looking at him. None of them were smiling. Daniel continued. He placed his chart on the table. Daily consumption, daily supply, the point where the 2 curves intersect, the day when consumption exceeds supply, the 12th. Weiss asked what he proposed. Daniel replied, not to cancel the offensive, to reorganize it. Instead of a single 40-mile push, 3 consecutive 15-mile advances, a 3-day halt after each advance. During those 3 days, the supply trains would catch up. The vanguard would redeploy to new positions. The staging areas would move forward, and then the next advance. It would be slower, by a week, but the army will reach its destination with full warehouses, not empty stomachs. Weiss objected. The enemy will regroup during that week. Daniel replied, the enemy will regroup anyway. The question is whether a well-fed army or a starving one will meet that regrouping. Weiss began to argue. Merritt raised his hand. Silence. He looked at the chart, then at Daniel, then at Weiss, and said he would send the proposal to Northern Army headquarters. The proposal was sent. Army headquarters rejected it. The offensive would proceed according to the original plan, the grand one, without supplies. Daniel sat in the tent and stared at the rejection. Una sat beside him. She knew the numbers. She knew what was coming. She asked quietly what to do. Daniel was silent for a minute. Then he said, "Do what we can." He couldn't change the offensive plan, but he could prepare his corps. 3 weeks before the start, he created a reserve, a hidden one, not listed in the documents. In every regimental warehouse, he hid a 5-day surplus of supplies. He redistributed, he economized, he cut back on non-food supplies. Fewer candles, less stationery, less fodder for the officers' horses. Every gram of food that could be saved was saved. He rerouted the supply lines. Instead of the standard supply routes, he laid out 3 alternative ones through villages that had stood empty since the previous year. In each village, he had placed a scout in advance, with water, with fodder, with a minimal supply of medicine. A web, invisible to headquarters, invisible to the enemy. Visible only to his quartermasters, who knew the coordinates of every outpost and the schedule of every supply train. The offensive began on the first day of the 8th month. 4 corps moved north. For the first 5 days, everything went according to plan. A beautiful plan. The mages breached the defenses. The cavalry flanked the enemy. The infantry took up positions. Victory after victory. On the 6th day, water supplies began to run low. On the 8th, the 1st Corps ran out of fodder. On the 10th, the 2nd Corps came to a standstill. The horses could not go on. The men were on half rations. On the 12th day, the advance halted. 3 of the 4 corps were stuck in place, without food, without fodder, without water for the day's march. The beautiful plan had crashed against that very same chart Daniel had laid on the table 3 weeks ago. The 3rd Corps kept moving, the only one of the 4, because the 3rd Corps had scouts on alternate routes, a hidden reserve, prepared staging areas, water purified by Lyra, forage delivered according to the schedule Daniel had drawn up 3 weeks before the start. The 3rd Corps had advanced another 8 miles while the rest stood still, and it seized the key crossing over the Crane River, without a fight, because the Imperial garrison at the crossing fled upon seeing that an entire corps was coming toward them, not just exhausted stragglers. When the Northern Army headquarters received the report that the 3rd Corps had taken the crossing, silence fell in the command tent. Then the Army commander, General Stanhall, asked a single question. "Who is in charge of supplies for the 3rd Corps?" They gave him a name. After the crossing of the Crane, Daniel Asher's life split in 2. The one everyone saw and the one only he saw. On the outside, there was success, swift, deafening. General Stanhall summoned him to Army headquarters. Daniel rode for 2 days on horseback, Zion by his side, silent. Irene stayed with the Corps to hold the line. Una stayed to keep count. Lyra stayed to purify the water. The headquarters of the Northern Army was located in Gravemount Castle on the southern shore of Crane. Stone walls, banners on the towers, everything Daniel had stayed away from on Earth. Generals, politics, beautiful uniforms. Stanhall turned out to be a short, wiry man of 60 with short white hair and a habit of standing by the window with his back to the person he was speaking to. He didn't turn around when Daniel entered. He asked without turning. It was he who had saved the 3rd Corps. Daniel replied that he hadn't saved it, he had supplied it. Stanhall turned. He looked. A boy. Glasses on a string. A uniform that didn't fit. A scar on his neck. Stanhall asked how old he was. Daniel replied that he would soon be 18. Stanhall was silent for 10 seconds. Then he said that in 3 days he would appoint him to the position of officer in the Northern Army's rear headquarters, with the authority to inspect all 4 corps, with the authority to change supply routes, with the authority to demand reports from any quartermaster of any rank. Daniel nodded. Then he asked one thing. Could he assemble his own team? Stanhall replied that he could. Daniel left the castle. He sat down on the steps. Zion stood beside him. He sat there, looking out at the castle courtyard. Couriers, officers, horses, banners. All of this was now his responsibility. Not a single supply train, not a single regiment, not a single corps, the entire army. 32,000 men. He closed his eyes. He counted. 32,000 mouths, 3 times a day. 96,000 meals a day. 672,000 a week. 2,680,000 a month. And every meal represents someone's life. He opened his eyes. He stood up. He went to work. That was what everyone saw. The young quartermaster received an unprecedented assignment. Rumors abounded. They called him a genius. They called him an upstart. They called him Stanhall's favorite. They called him a charlatan who'd gotten lucky once. He didn't care, because inside was a second life, the one only he could see, the one that lived in a coded notebook. Every night, when Zion fell asleep at the entrance and Una dozed off at the table, Daniel took out the notebook. He opened it, and he counted. Not the daily ledgers, not the supply train routes. He counted what he couldn't count during the day. Something big, something terrifying. He counted when Halderon would die. The numbers were simple. The war had been going on for 7 years. For 7 years, the country had spent more than it produced. For 7 years, the fields had not been sown because the peasants were in the army. For 7 years, the mines had operated at half capacity because the miners were in the army. For 7 years, the roads had not been repaired. Bridges had not been built. Livestock wasn't being raised. Halderon was living off its reserves, like a man who spends his savings. The savings were running out. According to Daniel's calculations, according to the actual calculations he kept in his notebook, there were 14 months and 11 days of reserves left. After that, there would be nothing to feed the army, not because the enemy would win, because the grain would run out. Victories hastened the end. Every victory cost resources. Every advance stretched the supply lines. Every captured city had to be fed. The offensive that headquarters considered a triumph had eaten up 2 months' worth of supplies. Halderon was winning battles and losing the war, and no one saw it, because no one was counting. Daniel was counting, every night, alone, with a candle stub, with columns of numbers that made him want to scream. He kept double books, by day, official reports, upbeat, casualties are falling, the system is working, supplies are improving, all true. By night, the real numbers. Grain is running out, iron is running out, horses are dying faster than they're being born, the population is shrinking, the tax base is shrinking every quarter. If anyone finds the second notebook and reads it, if anyone breaks his code, he'll be hanged for spreading panic, for undermining morale, for treason, before a trial, without a trial, because in Halderon, the truth that the war is lost is a crime more dangerous than any betrayal. He knew this, and he kept counting, because if you don't keep track, you can't plan, and if you don't plan, 14 months and 11 days will simply pass, and nothing will change. And the 32,000 men who ate his rations and slept in the warmth of his blankets will die of starvation in the midst of a war that has been won. He couldn't let that happen. Everything he did during the day, every slat, every form, every swallow, none of it was about improving supplies. It was about time. Every percentage point saved was an extra day. Every hole in the theft plugged was an extra week. He wasn't improving the army. He was buying it time. By the day, by the week, by the month. In secret, in silence. With a smile by day and terror by night. Una was the first to notice. She didn't find the notebook. She noticed his eyes. In the mornings, after the nights when he'd been counting, the eyes of a man who knows what he doesn't want to know. She asked him once, early in the morning, when the two of them were poring over the ledgers. She asked what he was counting at night. Daniel didn't answer. Una didn't repeat the question. But from that day on, she began to work even more meticulously, as if she sensed that every grain saved was not just accounting, but salvation. Perhaps she understood more than he thought. Morel returned as promised, a month later. He arrived without assistance, alone, with the same notebook, half filled. He sat down across from Daniel and said he'd read his calculations 3 times. and that he didn't understand one principle, the moving average, what that was. Daniel explained. If you calculate consumption for a single day, the figure fluctuates. Today it's high, tomorrow it's low. It seems chaotic, but if you take the average over 7 days, or 14, the fluctuations smooth out, and a trend becomes visible. Where consumption is heading, up, down, steady. It's like looking at a river. The waves are the days, the current is the trend. The waves are deceptive, the current isn't. Morel listened. Then he closed his eyes, opened them, and said quietly, he'd fought with magic for 30 years. And for 30 years he'd thought magic was the highest knowledge. And now, a boy with coal and a sailcloth was showing him a way to see the future, without magic, without rituals, without reagents, just numbers. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't know what to say, because Morel didn't understand the most terrifying thing. The moving average showed the future, and that future was black. The Halderon resource curve was going down, smoothly, inexorably, like a river toward a waterfall, and Daniel saw the waterfall every night in his notebook. Morel left 3 days later, but this time he left something behind. There was a note on Daniel's desk, a short one. If you ever need help that only a red rank mage can provide, don't ask. Just send a note with a single word, and I'll come. The word was there, the table. Daniel read it, folded it, put it in a folder, next to Colonel Rhett's note, next to the wooden soldier figurine, on the shelf where things that couldn't be measured in numbers were kept. The 9th month. Daniel was working on 2 fronts. By day, he was reorganizing the supply lines for the entire Northern Army. By night, he was rewriting the war. Not the war the generals were fighting, another one. A war against the clock ticking in his notebook. 14 months turned into 12, then into 11. The offensive had taken a heavier toll than he'd anticipated. The 3 provinces the army had recaptured from the Empire turned out to be empty, scorched. The Imperials had destroyed everything in their retreat. Granaries, mills, wells, bridges. Halderon had paid for the 3 provinces and now had to feed them. Feed the void. Daniel calculated and recalculated. Cut back. He redistributed. Every day he found yet another way to squeeze another week out of the system. But the weeks ran out faster than he could find them. He needed a different plan. Not how to feed the army, how to end the war. That thought came to him one night at the end of the 9th month. He was sitting over a map, not his supply map, a strategic one, a large map of the entire northern front that he had copied at Stanhall's headquarters. The positions of both armies were marked on it. The Halderon Corps in blue, the Imperial forces in red, and between them, lines, roads, rivers, passes. Daniel looked at these lines not as a general, as a logistician, and he saw what the generals did not see. He saw the Imperial supply trains, their routes, their depots, their choke points. The Empire of Kaidarat was supplied through 4 mountain passes. 4, just 4. All the food, all the fodder, all the reagents for the mages, everything went through 4 points on the map. If we cut them off, not all 4, that's impossible. But if we disrupt the flow at even 2 of them, slow them down, confuse them, create a 2-week delay, the Imperial army will start to starve. Not immediately, slowly. Just as Halderon is starving now, only faster. Because the Imperial army is fighting far from home. Its supply lines are longer. Its reserves of strength are smaller. Daniel knew this. He felt it in the numbers. That instinct that comes after thousands of hours poring over reports. When numbers cease to be numbers and come alive, they breathe, they pulse, they speak. The Imperial numbers told him that the enemy was also at its limit. He came to Stanhall with a plan, not a military one, a logistical one. He proposed not attacking the Imperial army, attacking its supply lines. Not a general battle, a series of small raids, cavalry detachments of 50 riders. The objective was not to kill. The objective was to slow them down, Cut off the road, burn the bridge, steal a herd of horses from a staging area, poison a well along the route. Not with poison, fill it with dirt. So the Imperials would spend 2 days clearing it out. 2 days means 2 days without water. 2 days without water means 30 sick horses. 30 sick horses means 5 wagons that won't make it to the front. 5 wagons means a ton of grain that someone won't receive. A trifle, a grain of sand. But grain of sand by grain of sand, day after day, week after week, and an avalanche. Stanhall listened, silently, his face impassive. Then he asked, "How did Daniel know the location of the Imperial warehouses?" Daniel placed a folder in front of him. It contained captured documents seized during the taking of the crossing over the Crane. Imperial waybills, route sheets, supply officers' logs, everything that ordinary recovery teams had thrown away as trash. Pieces of paper. Who needs pieces of paper when there are swords and magic staffs? Daniel had picked up every single one. He collected, translated, compiled into a table, and now he knew more about Imperial supplies than most Imperial generals. Stanhall read the folder for an hour, then he closed it. He looked at Daniel, and for the first time since they'd met, he smiled. Subtly, just his lips, like a man who'd found the answer to a question that had tormented him for 7 years. The raids began 2 weeks later. Small groups, fast, stealthy. They didn't fight. They disrupted, broke bridges, filled in wells. They stole horses, scattered nails on the roads, spoiled salt supplies by mixing in sand. Small scale, underhanded, boring. Without glory, without feats of valor, without archmages in billowing cloaks. The result became apparent after a month. Imperial regiments on the front lines began receiving supplies with a 3-day delay, then 5 days, then a week. The horses were losing weight, the soldiers were grumbling. The mages complained that the reagents weren't of the right quality. Imperial headquarters didn't understand what was happening. They searched for the cause. They investigated the quartermasters. They punished the supply officers. They changed the routes. But every new route was disrupted within 2 days. Because Daniel could read their logic. He sat in a tent with a map and predicted where they would reroute after each raid. And he sent the next group there. He waged war against Imperial supply lines as if playing chess, 3 moves ahead. Only the pieces were wagons and the board was a map. In the midst of this invisible war, what Daniel had both expected and feared happened. Grand Duke Alberon Cast arrived at the camp. Haldoran's Minister of War, the king's cousin, hero of 3 battles, recipient of every order, the man who embodied the old war, the war of valor and magic. Cast did not come to inspect. He came to stop it. Rumors had reached him that some young quartermaster was reorganizing the army, that he had introduced some forms, that he was sending out raiding parties without the War Council's knowledge, that he was undermining the foundations. Cast was tall, broad-shouldered, 55 years old, graying temples, a uniform embroidered with gold, 3 rows of metal ribbons. He entered Daniel's tent without warning, without knocking, with 2 aides. He looked around. He saw charts on the walls, maps, forms, markings on the diagrams. Yuna at the table, Zion at the entrance with his blades, Irene in the corner with a folder. And Daniel, skinny, wearing glasses, with a charcoal pencil behind his ear. Cast looked down at him and said that this disgrace ends today. An army is commanded by warriors, not accountants. War is blood and valor, not paperwork and stamps. And a boy who has never held a sword will not teach Haldoran how to fight. Daniel listened, silently, calmly. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He waited for Cast to finish. Cast finished. Daniel stood up. He walked over to the wall. He took down 1 chart. He placed it in front of the Duke. Just 1. Casualties across the entire Northern Army, before his appointment and after. 1 chart, 2 columns, before, after. Cast looked at it. His expression didn't change. He said the numbers could be faked. Daniel replied that they could. but they could also be verified. Every single one. He suggested the Duke choose any regiment, any one, and verify it personally. Cast didn't answer. He turned and walked out. His aides followed him. Irene approached Daniel. She said quietly that this was a war, not against the Empire, against the Duke. And the Duke was more dangerous, because the Empire was far away, but the Duke had the power to sign an order removing him with a single stroke of his pen. Daniel nodded. He knew. The next 3 months were the hardest of his life. Daniel devised a plan for raids against Imperial supply lines, using captured documents to predict enemy routes. The raids began to disrupt Imperial logistics from within, creating mounting delays. Grand Duke Cast, Haldoran's Minister of War, arrived to halt the reforms, believing that accountants should not command the army. Cast did not sign the order of dismissal. He did worse. He began to act according to the law. Within the first month after the visit, 4 official requests from the War Council landed on Daniel's desk. Each demanded a report, a detailed one, on every decision, on every raid, on every movement of every wagon, in the form approved by the Council 40 years ago. The form consisted of 23 items. It took a whole day to fill out a single report for a single decision. Daniel had 4 requests a week. This meant that 4 days out of 7 he had to write reports instead of working. It was a precise and calculated blow. Cass did not look the system. He drowned it in paperwork. Una did the calculations. Irene checked. Lyra helped as best she could. But the days slipped away. The system ran on inertia, but Daniel couldn't develop it. He couldn't respond to new challenges. He couldn't plan a week ahead because he was busy with reports from the previous one. In the second month of the standoff, Cast struck a second blow. He secured the transfer of 4 of Daniel's 11 trained accountants to other units. According to regulations, according to the law, out of necessity. Every transfer had impeccable paperwork to justify it. The network began to fray. 2 regiments were left without accountants. Data arrived late. Errors multiplied. The losses that Daniel had kept down to 4% began to creep upward. 5, 6, 7. Cast was in no hurry. He knew that a system without people is dead, and he patiently pulled people out of it, one by one, by the book. Daniel didn't sleep, for the 3rd month in a row, 2 hours a day, counting, writing reports, filling out council forms, patching holes in the network of counters. His body couldn't take it. His hands shook constantly, not from nerves, from exhaustion. Una made him eat. He'd forget. Zion would bring food and stand over him until he'd eaten it all. Lyra once found him asleep at the table, his face buried in the ledger, and silently draped her cloak over him. Warm, smelling of lavender and magic. He slept for 2 hours under that cloak, and that was the longest sleep he'd had in a week. By the end of the 3rd month of the standoff, Daniel realized he was losing. Not to the Empire, to the Cast. The system depended on him, personally. If he broke, the system would break. And he was breaking, slowly but surely. The Cast was winning not by force, but by time, just as winter defeats those who haven't stocked up on firewood. Salvation came from where he least expected it. Maggie O'Doherty, a market vendor, the owner of the field kitchen, Red Mag. She barged into his tent at dawn on a gray morning, big, loud. Her hands were burned from the cauldrons. Her apron was splattered with grease. She looked at Daniel, at the bags under his eyes, at his trembling hands, at the empty bowl he hadn't touched. And she said he looked worse than her late husband did after the 3rd siege. And he looked so bad that horses would shy away from him. Daniel didn't smile. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled. Maggie sat down across from him, heavily. The chair creaked. She said she knew about the Duke. The whole camp knew. And she hadn't come to comfort him. She'd come with a proposal. She'd spent 20 years on the front lines, 20 years feeding the army, 20 years dealing with quartermasters. And in 20 years, she's gotten to know every supplier, every middleman, and every thief within a 100-mile radius of any point on the northern front. She knows who sells grain honestly, who mixes sand into the flour, who doubles the price, who gives credit, who demands cash. She doesn't know this from ledgers, from life. 20 years of life among these people. She offered him a deal. She'll take care of all the suppliers, purchasing, negotiations, quality control. She does it faster than any accountant because she doesn't check papers. She checks people. She can tell by a handshake whether a person is lying or not. And Daniel is freed. He stops wasting time on trivialities and does what only he can do: calculate, plan, think. Daniel looked at her. Then he took a blank sheet of paper out of the folder. He wrote a contract. Short, 1 page, no tricks, straight price, straight terms, straight conditions. He placed it in front of her. Maggie read it. She looked up, and in a hoarse voice said that he was either a saint or a fool, and both were dangerous. Then she signed it. From that day on, Maggie O'Doherty became the head of the rear's rear. Unofficially. Not recorded anywhere, not in a single ledger, but every supplier within a 100-mile radius knew that red-haired Mag checked every sack, personally. And if the sack was light, if the grain was damp, if the flour was mixed with sand, then the supplier would have to deal with a woman who had fed the army for 20 years and knew 40 ways to make a man's life unbearable without breaking a single law. Procurement losses dropped within a week. Daniel sighed. For the first time in 3 months, Maggie had given him breathing room, and that breathing room gave him time to think, and he came up with a plan. Not how to defeat Casta, how to make Casta unnecessary. He wrote a letter, not to Stanhall, not to Merritt, not to Morel. He wrote a letter to Princess Seyon, the 3rd princess of Haldoran, the king's daughter from his 2nd wife, 5th in line to the throne, a political non-entity. He had never met her, but he had read her notes in the margins of budget documents that passed through the chancellery. The notes were brief, precise, with numbers. Someone at court understood economics, and that someone was the princess who was only allowed to embroider. The letter was businesslike, 1 page, no flattery, no pleas. It laid out the facts: army losses before and after the reform, savings in gold, the cost of each innovation, and a single line at the end. Your Highness, the army saves 200 gold pieces a month. The military council spends 150 gold pieces a month on reports detailing how it does so. If you are interested in discussing this arithmetic, I am at your service. The letter was sent by courier. The reply arrived 9 days later, brief, on expensive paper, with a personal seal. Princess Seyon announced that she was taking patronage over the rear corps. Formally, it was an honorary and empty position. In reality, it meant that any request from the military council now had to go through the princess's office, and the princesses had the right to hold requests for review, indefinitely. The flow of reports dried up within a week. Cast understood. Daniel had found a patron whom the Duke could not touch, a princess of royal blood, the king's daughter, a connection of a different order. Cast did not give up, but he paused, for a while, and that time was enough. Duke Cast began systematically stifling the reforms through bureaucratic requests and the transfer of trained accountants. Market vendor Maggie O'Doherty took control of the suppliers, freeing up Daniel's time for strategy. Daniel wrote to Princess Seyon, who took patronage over the rear corps and blocked Cast's bureaucratic attack. Princess Seyon arrived at the camp a month later, without an entourage, without a carriage, on an ordinary, in a traveling dress, with a single groom, quiet, pale, with a long black braid. She entered Daniel's tent as one enters a library, carefully, with respect for what was inside. She stood and looked at the walls, at the charts, at the maps, at the forms. And Daniel saw her eyes moving across the columns of numbers, not skimming, reading. She understood what was written on those walls. She turned to him. She asked what the red dot on the map near Dane Pass meant. Daniel replied that it was an imperial warehouse. She asked how he knew. He showed her the captured shipping documents. She read them, nodded, and said the dot was in the wrong place. The warehouse should be 3 miles south, Because there's no water source at the pass, and a warehouse without water makes no sense. And 3 miles south, there's a stream. She knew. She had read geographical maps of the province of Dane in the palace library 2 years ago, because she was curious, and because she had nothing else to do. Daniel looked at her, then at the map. He checked. She was right. The warehouse was supposed to be further south. He moved the marker, and realized that standing before him was a person who could keep his ledger just as well as Yuna. Maybe better. Because Yuna calculated faster. But Sehyun saw the bigger picture. He offered her a seat. She sat down. He placed a draft of a report to the king in front of her, on supplies, on economy, on forecasts, with a note in the corner. Your Highness, if you agree with the calculations, sign it. If not, correct it. I trust your corrections more than my own. Sehyun read the report for an hour, in silence. Then she picked up a quill, and made 5 corrections, all to the point. First, he had overestimated the harvest in the northern provinces. There had been a drought there for 2 years. The actual figures are 20% lower. Second, he didn't account for the fact that 3 mines in the eastern province are closed due to flooding. There will be less iron. Third, tax revenues from the southern trading cities have fallen because 2 major trading houses went bankrupt last quarter. Fourth, the price of horses has risen by 1/3 due to a plague in the western herds. Fifth, the grain supply in the royal granaries is 100,000 bushels less than stated in the official reports. She knew this because she had personally recounted the treasury records to which she had access as a princess of royal blood. Daniel read the corrections. Each one made his forecast worse. Each shortened the time. 14 months and 11 days. With her corrections, 11 months. He looked up. Sehyun was watching him, quietly, calmly. She knew. Not because she had read his notebook, because she had calculated it herself for years, alone, in the palace, with the same numbers, with the same horror, and with the same silence. Because in Halderon, a princess isn't supposed to know that the country is dying. She said quietly, she knows they're losing. Not the war. A war can be won. They're losing time. And she didn't come for the patronage. She came because, for the first time in her life, she saw a person who was also doing the calculations. Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he pulled a notebook from under the table. That very one. The encrypted one. He opened it. He placed it in front of her. Sehyun looked at the cipher, then at him. He explained the key. A simple substitution cipher. She read for 20 minutes. Then she closed the notebook. Her hands weren't shaking, but her knuckles had turned white, just like Irene's when she read the killer's note. She asked what to do. Daniel answered, end the war. Faster than time runs out. Not to win, to end it. To force the empire to the negotiating table, not in a year, in 4 months, before winter. Because if Halderon enters winter without a peace treaty, there will be no next spring. From that day on, they worked together, every evening. Sehyun stayed at the camp. She refused to return to court. They sent her an angry letter from her older sister. She didn't reply. They sent her an order from the chancellor. She wrote that she was busy. She received a personal request from the king's father. She replied that she would return when her work was done. The task was simple and impossible, to draft a plan for peace negotiations in which Halderon would appear the victor even though it stood on the brink of ruin. To do this, 3 things had to be done. First, win one major battle, one that would make the empire realize that war would cost more than peace. Second, show that Halderon could keep fighting. A bluff, but a bluff backed by figures that couldn't be verified from the outside. Third, offer terms the empire could accept without losing face, because an enemy backed into a corner doesn't surrender. It fights. Daniel took on the first and second tasks. Sehyun took the third. She the language of diplomacy. She knew imperial etiquette. She knew what could be proposed and what would be offensive. She wrote drafts of the terms at night, while Daniel calculated, 2 tables side by side. 2 candles. Silence. Yuna saw them together and remained silent. Her pen moved smoothly. Her face gave nothing away. But she began to work with even greater precision, as if every perfect number were the answer to a question she hadn't asked. Irene saw and remained silent too. She understood what was happening. Not a romance, a partnership. The kind of intimacy more terrifying than any kiss. When 2 people share a secret on which the life of a country depends. Zion saw and remained silent. She was always silent. But now she was silent in a different way, with attention. She didn't understand the numbers on the walls, but she understood people. And she saw that, for the first time in a long while, Daniel was breathing more evenly, like a man who had been carrying a sack alone and had finally shared it with someone. By the end of the 11th month, the plan was ready. Battle, bluff, terms. 3 points, 3 steps toward peace. One thing remained, to convince those who were to carry it out. Princess Sehyun arrived at the camp and turned out to be the only person at court who independently calculated the country's resources. Daniel showed her the secret notebook, and together they devised a plan to end the war in 4 months. The plan consisted of 3 parts: the decisive battle, a bluff about resources, and peace terms the empire could accept. The Battle of the 3 Fords was not a battle. It was what Daniel on Earth called a perception management operation. 3 Forks, the place where the Crane River splits into 3 branches, a strategic crossing. The Imperial Corps stood on the north bank, 12,000 men, mages, cavalry, infantry. By all the rules of this world, they had to attack. Storm the crossing. Archmages in the lead, infantry following. Blood, fire, valor. Headquarters was already preparing an assault plan. Daniel came to Stanhall 2 weeks before the appointed date, with a different plan. Not to storm. Wait. According to his calculations, the Imperial Corps at 3 Forks received supplies via a single route, through the Kolm Pass. The Kolm Pass was the second of 4 key passes. Daniel's raiding parties had been operating there for 2 months. Bridges were repaired and destroyed again. Roads were cleared and blocked again. Supply trains were delayed by a day. 2, 3. According to Daniel's calculations, the Imperial Corps' depots at 4 fords had enough fodder left for 18 days. If Kolm Pass were completely blocked for 2 weeks, not by raids, a complete blockade, a cavalry detachment that would take up position at the pass and not let a single wagon through. In 18 days, the Imperial Corps would begin to starve. In 25, the horses would start to drop. In 30, they would leave on their own. Stanhall listened. He was silent. Then he asked, "What if the calculation is wrong? What if they have more supplies? What if they have a hidden cache?" Daniel replied, "Then we'll lose the cavalry detachment and 2 weeks of time. But if the calculation is correct, we'll secure the crossing without a single casualty." Stanhall thought about it for a day. Then he agreed. A cavalry detachment of 300 riders under the command of Colonel Rhett set out for the Kolm Pass. The very same Rhett whom Daniel had led a supply train through the forest trails 6 months earlier. Rhett received his orders. To take up a position at the pass, do not let the supply trains through, do not engage in open combat, hold the position. Rhett nodded. He left. And he held the position. For 18 days, Daniel sat in his tent and counted. Every day, a courier from the observers on the front lines brought a report. The Imperial camp on the north bank. What was visible? Smoke from the kitchens. Number. Intensity. Horses at the watering hole. How many? Condition. Activity at the positions. A lot. A little. Daniel read the reports like a doctor reads test results. On the 5th day, there was less smoke. They're cooking less often, saving fuel, which means they're saving food. On the 8th day, there were more horses at the watering hole. Not because there were more horses, because they're being led there more often. Hungry horses drink more. On the 12th day, activity at the positions decreased. The soldiers are conserving their strength. On the 15th day, a supply train left the Imperial camp, heading south. Empty. It was going for supplies. That means their reserves are critical. On the 18th day, silence. No smoke, no movement, no sounds. Daniel stood on the hill with a spyglass. Stanhall was nearby. Morel was nearby, having arrived after receiving a note with a single word. Irene was nearby. Zion, Yuna, Lyra, Sehun, everyone. On the northern bank, the Imperial camp stood silent and lifeless. Then the gates opened, and an officer emerged, with a white flag. Behind him, a column, 12,000 men. Quiet, without a fight, without a shout, without a single spell.